Welcome back, everybody. Now, it has 120 parliamentarians and legislators in its network and is present in 22 countries in Africa. That is the African Parliamentarians Association for Human Rights, which is an independent, non-partisan network of parliamentarians from the African continent. To tell us more, we are now joined via Zoom by founder and the chairperson of the steering committee, Nqabayomzi Kwankwa. Mr. Kwankwa, very good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Mr. Good morning, and thank you very much for having us.
Now, give us some brief background into what the African Parliamentarians Association for Human Rights is all about and what the inspiration is behind it.
We're a network of young, very committed parliamentarians from all over Africa who seek to promote democracy and human rights in Africa. We have focused on a number of human rights areas over the years, starting with the right to freedom of religion or belief, which affects the Arab Maghreb region to a large extent, and some Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sub-Sahara, right? Second one obviously has to do with consolidating democracy in the rest of the African continent. And we've had serious challenges insofar as that is concerned. And what we have done is, apart from being a network of more than 100 members of parliament, but we have almost on a yearly basis focused on key thematic areas when it comes to human rights. For example, recently we held a steering committee meeting in Tanzania where we were discussing primarily human rights concerns and areas of concern in that part of the African continent, which is the Horn of Africa, the East Africa region. And we discovered that there are many similarities between some of the human rights challenges they experience, apart from issues that have to do with democracy, freedom of expression challenges here and there. But there's also a prevalence of gender-based violence in Tanzania. And the same can be said about countries such as Sierra Leone. And these are countries where, if you were to include Ghana, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we don't just have membership of members of parliament who are affiliated to AFRIPAHR, but we have local caucuses which have been launched and are recognized by their parliaments. And when local caucuses are launched by local members of parliament, it means they enjoy certain recognition by their parliament. They're expected to make submissions when, say, there are human rights. In other countries, they have human rights committees. They're expected to make human rights submissions on various human rights violations and various human rights concerns in their particular country. So they serve as a watchdog. But more importantly, what we seek to also be doing on a daily basis, because we're members of parliament, is to hold the executive of our own respective countries to account about human rights challenges and concerns and violations that are occurring in their home countries. I want to give an example. One of the issues we're talking about was migration and how there seems to be a lack of a common migrations policy in Africa. Apart from everything else that heads of states have actually mentioned and said in various meetings, assemblies of the African Union, but there seems to be a lack of a common migrations policy and how the entire African continent should deal with this question of migration. As a result, you see a refugee crisis in the African continent that is not handled properly. In December, for example, not so long ago, a group of young 27 Ethiopians who were moving apparently from Ethiopia to South Africa were found dead, dumped in Zambia, 27 of them. And that is just one case out of many cases where people who try to move for whatever reasons from their countries, others fleeing for their safety, others fleeing for socioeconomic reasons, face subhuman conditions in transit, but they also face subhuman conditions in receiving countries. But there seems to also be no dialogue between the countries where people are fleeing from and the receiving countries in terms of how to deal and treat migrants, because we're all Africans after all. We seem to respect more the artificial borders which were imposed on us than the human life and the human beings who are affected by the poor misrule and the leadership crisis in their countries. We're also trying to get young people in general to draw a link, to know that there's a correlation between the leaders the democratic choices they make in their countries, the leaders who end up being in charge of their countries and the destiny of their countries, as a way of trying to resolve voter apathy. Because in the majority of African countries, we find that voter apathy among the youth is very high, but they are the ones who are most affected or who are disproportionately affected by decisions of bad leaders who come into government later on. It's almost like, in some instances, young people wake up later after a government has been elected, then they realize that this is not the right person for the country. When things start falling apart, they move to other areas. When they had an opportunity to actually influence their destiny.
Now, Nqabayomzi, you've just laid the groundwork for us to understand what this institution is all about. Let's now talk about the mix of workshops, the consultations, fact-finding missions, and meetings that you've hosted to date, and what came out of those.
Look, for instance, we're very proud of the contribution we made in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2018, where we had a solidarity mission because there were serious human rights violations which were taking place at the time during the term of former President Kabila. We were also granted the status to be one of the election observers in the Democratic Republic of Congo as they were transitioned to a democratic government I think it was in 2018, towards the end with the elections there. Yes. Even in that country, as was the case with many African countries, we're able to interact with a number of stakeholders around the table, lobby for support in some areas and lobby for them to be sanctioned in areas where they were not doing so well, or to make sure that there were certain areas of improvements that were worked on almost on a daily basis. We continue to do that around the continent. In fact, before, I want to give an example, before there were peace talks between Ethiopia and Eritrea, if you like, before there were peace talks, we were there on the ground with our Ethiopian MPs, negotiating with them, discussing issues of how they could also influence their executive towards having peace talks, towards having an inclusive discussion about how those countries can coexist peacefully. In fact, at the time, we tried to reach out to some human rights organizations in Eritrea, but focusing mainly on those that were willing to have an inclusive and a constructive dialogue around those issues. So behind the scenes, we do a lot of, if you like, parliamentary diplomacy, parliamentary diplomatic work behind the scenes to ensure that our peers, especially members of parliament around the continent, were on the same page insofar as the challenges that face their respective region insofar as human rights are concerned, but also the challenges that they face their respective regions and countries insofar as democracy and general human rights are concerned.
So do parliamentarians participate as individuals or as members of political or government bodies or any other organization?
No. They have to participate as individuals, because then you create problems if people come and represent their own political parties. You want people to be able to exercise their conscience freely, but to also realize that they have a responsibility towards Africans and their constituencies rather than their political parties. Because even when you become a member of parliament, you swear allegiance to your own constitution and not to your own political party.
And why is that a critical part of the network?
The reason why that's a critical part of the network is that then people will come with their own party positions into a network such as ourselves. You want to be able to get people to exercise their independence, to be able to do what is right for the African continent and not necessarily be influenced by their own party positions insofar as those issues are concerned. Because if you have to do that, then you can't run a network of more than 100 people, because they will all come to meetings with their own party positions instead of us being guided by AFRIPAHR values.
Right. So what are some of the major challenges facing the organization, and what plans have been put in place to overcome them?
Well, one of the challenges that face the network, obviously, is that it's one of resource constraint. In a number of instances, we have to tap into our own financial resources to be able to make things happen. In fact, for the first 2.5 years, when we started in 2017, we solely depended on the resources of the individual members of AFRIPAHR until we're able to get some funding, which focuses on a number of programs, for example, from Norway. But other than that, we have not been able to attract funding from the African continent, which would then enable us to upscale some of the work that we're doing and to also be able to cover areas such as the Arab Maghreb region, where we have not done a lot of work, and where ideally would also like to be able to launch local caucuses there, so that you have members of parliament who are dedicated to the work of AFRIPAHR and focus on the work of AFRIPAHR, its ideals and values, almost on a daily basis, as is the case in Ghana, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Tanzania, DRC, and so on. So really that is what one requires. But what we are very clear about, Simpiwe, is that we are not extension of the Pan-African Parliament or any of the institutional framework of the African continent, because then that tends to limit you to a large extent. At times, say, if the Pan-African Parliament is not doing its job, if you're only perceived as its extension, you can't hold it to account. If the AU is failing, as I was indicating to you, to develop a common migration policy for the African continent, you'd have to actually find yourself being lost in the bureaucracy of the institution instead of being able to hold it to account. In fact, Simpiwe, even at the time...
And it led to my next question, Nqabayomzi, with regards to whether will there not be competing interests between the Pan-African Parliament, for instance, or the African Union's African Commission on Human and People's Rights? Because all these other institutions, they also advocate for the same issues that you're advocating for. Is there maybe an area of cooperation between you and the other organizations?
Well, but yeah, they do advocate for the same issues, but how much have they actually achieved insofar as that is concerned? I want to give you an example. We wrote to the Human Rights Commission.
So basically you are competing with them in terms of advocating the very same issues?
Not necessarily competing, it depends on the issue. If, for example, you can see that there is impressive work being done, you join efforts and collaborate with them. But if you find that they are sleeping on duty, what you have to do as a member of parliament is to hold them to account. We held them to account, the Human Rights Commission, on the slave crisis. Remember, there were many people who were trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea and in search of better opportunities, but going through the Arab Maghreb region were captured as slaves. We raised that issue to the Human Rights Commission long before, it is during its infancy stages, before it made it into the headline news. But guess what happened? There was no response. There were numerous follow-ups saying what is happening, what is Africa's response, and there was an AU meeting coming up. And when the AU meeting came up, we didn't see any clear resolutions about how to hold those member states who were responsible, whose citizens were responsible for that conduct. There was no clear plan as to how to hold those member states to account and to ensure that that didn't happen again.
Why focus on human rights specifically?
You have to focus on human rights, because how do you build a fair and inclusive Africa if you are going to exclude because there are gross and serious human rights violations on the African continent that we experience on a daily basis, but you can't create an environment that is conducive for Africa to succeed without Africa respecting the human rights of the people they lead, the African leaders in general. So in order to create conducive conditions for Africa and Africans to thrive, you have to create a solid foundation where human rights are respected and human rights are promoted, because they go to the core of the dignity of any human being.
And what lessons have come from the different events in Nigeria and Ghana?
The lessons we've learned is that, yes, while we have achieved, for example, I would say to a large extent, we've been able to get a lot of progressive young leaders, not only young leaders, but we've managed to get a lot of progressive leaders join the network. But at times, I think when we started, it was about a game of numbers, making sure that we have numbers, the right numbers of people and the representation around the continent. But later on, we realized that we needed to focus more on committed individuals that can actually be able to make sacrifices for the network. The second one obviously has to do with the fact that I think through networks such as this one, you are able to develop Pan-African programs and make people realize that we are interconnected as a continent. The success of any country depends on the success of other countries in the rest of the African continent, but also through the workshops that you do, through the awareness programs that you implement on a daily basis, what you're able to do, you're able to develop a cadre of parliamentarians around the continent to become ambassadors of human rights, but who at times, because some of them now have moved on to be ambassadors of their countries, some of them are deputy speakers of their countries, they lead institutions, but they take with them some of the lessons from Africa, but they also take with them some of the programs of Africa. That is why it has been easy in some of these countries to launch caucuses, because now some of people who are ordinary members of AFRIPAHR occupy leadership and strategic positions in their countries, and they understand the value and the importance of having such networks and institutions around the continent.
All right, Nqabayomzi, unfortunately we're out of time, and I certainly hope that we would have another conversation about how you measure the success and the failures perhaps of a project of this magnitude. We do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Much obliged, sir. Thank you.
That was the founder and chair of the African Parliamentarians Association for Human Rights, Nqabayomzi Kwankwa, speaking to us about this independent, non-partisan network of parliamentarians from the African continent and its work.